I was very surprised when they became, successful hit songs. So now I wish there was a formula. It'd be a lot easier to just plug in numbers and get results. I just sort of follow my instincts when I start working on a song or a piece of music, and there are some arrangements in on Boston albums that are very outlandish, that I definitely don't follow a formula, and I actually I never thought that I would be successful at it.
Imagine you're a record executive in 1975. A tape lands on your desk from an unknown musician in Massachusetts. It sounds enormous. Layered guitars, huge harmonies, a wall of sound that belongs on an arena stage. You assume there's a full band behind it, a proper studio, a seasoned producer. There isn't. The recording was built almost entirely by one man, an MIT-trained engineer named Tom Scholz, working from a basement while holding down a day job at Polaroid. And the strangest part wasn't that Scholz had created something the industry couldn't explain. It's that the industry was about to sign him, try to change him, and discover that Tom Scholz had no intention of making records the way the music business wanted him to. In the 1970s, a record got made a certain way. A band walked into a studio. A producer ran the session. A label controlled the timeline. And the release. That was the system. It had printed money for decades. And Tom Scholz wasn't trying to enter it. He was trying to solve a recording problem nobody had asked him to solve. Scholz had a master's degree in mechanical engineering from MIT and a product design job at Polaroid, where he worked on audio electronics and tape recording technology. He was, by his own later admission, a horrible employee, because the real work started when he got home. Every night, Scholz disappeared into the basement of a rented apartment building in Watertown, Massachusetts. He sank roughly $30,000 of his and his wife Cindy's savings into recording equipment he'd partly built himself. That was their house money. They never bought the house. He'd been writing music since 1969. For years, he experimented. His friend Jim Mazdea played drums. Then Scholz overdubbed every other instrument himself. Guitars, bass, keyboards. All Scholz. When the instrumental tracks were ready, a singer named Brad Delp would come in and lay down the vocals, one track at a time. Delp had a voice that could peel paint off a cathedral ceiling. Together, they built something that sounded like a full professional band. It wasn't. It was two guys and a basement. By 1973, Scholz had a 6-song demo tape. He and Cindy sent copies to every record company they could find. One label after another rejected the demos. The most memorable rejection came from Epic Records, the company that would eventually release the album. Their A&R department wrote back, stating that the band had absolutely nothing new to offer. Scholz found it funny enough to repeat for the next 30 years. So why did an MIT engineer keep spending his Polaroid salary on a project nobody wanted? That question only makes sense if you think of Scholz as someone chasing a record deal. He wasn't. He was chasing a sound. The demos weren't auditions, they were experiments. And experiments don't stop because somebody says no. By 1975, the demo tape found its way to two Boston area promoters, Paul Ahern and Charlie McKenzie. They heard what the labels had missed. They started shopping it harder. And this time, 3 major labels responded. RCA came back around. A&M showed interest. And Epic, the same label that had written that dismissive letter, suddenly wanted in. The tape they'd rejected hadn't changed. The industry's ears had. But Epic had a problem. The demo sounded professional. The A&R people liked it. But when they looked closer, there was no band. Not in the traditional sense. The tape was essentially Scholz and Delp overdubbing in a basement. Epic's A&R chief on the East Coast, Lenny Petsy, raised the concern directly. There's no band here. Producer John Boylan, who was working to broker the deal, had a response that he later shared publicly. "We've got a band," he said. "We lied." Epic needed a live showcase before they'd commit. So Scholz, Delp, and Boylan assembled a performing lineup. Barry Goudreau, who'd played guitar with Scholz in earlier projects, came back in. Fran Sheehan joined on bass. And because original drummer Jim Mastea had stepped back, Sib Hashian took over the drum seat. In November 1975, this freshly assembled group performed for a couple of Epic executives in a warehouse that doubled as Aerosmith's rehearsal space. The label liked what they heard. Scholz and Delp, the only two people who'd actually created the recordings, signed a contract. The deal called for 10 albums deliverable in 6 years. That was industry standard at the time. Nobody involved seemed to notice how absurd that timeline would become. Now the label expected the obvious next step. Go to a proper studio in Los Angeles, work with a producer, re-record the demos professionally. That's how the system worked. And from Epic's perspective, it was completely logical. They'd invested money. They wanted a product they could control. Scholz knew something the label didn't. His recordings depended on isolation, experimentation, and total control over every instrument. He couldn't recreate what he'd built under fluorescent lights with a union engineer watching over his shoulder. There was also a practical obstacle. Epic's parent company, CBS, had an agreement with the Broadcast Engineers Union, NABET. If recording happened outside a Columbia-owned studio, a union-approved engineer had to be present. Imagine a compulsively controlling, still-employed Polaroid engineer working in a rented basement in Watertown at midnight with a union representative sitting next to him. It was, as Boylan later put it, too horrible and too comic to contemplate. So Boylan came up with a plan. He offered Scholz a deal. Scholz would re-record the album in his basement and not tell anyone. Meanwhile, Boylan would take Delp, Goudreau, Sheehan, and Hashian to Los Angeles, where they'd record some material in a proper studio. Epic would see bodies in California. Studio invoices. A producer on site. The appearance of a normal recording process. The reality was something else entirely. Bodies in Los Angeles. Invoices in Los Angeles. Tom Scholz in his basement in Watertown, re-recording every song from the demo on the same equipment. Boylan even paid for some of Scholz's equipment rentals out of his own pocket, so the invoices wouldn't surface in front of Epic's accountants. The total cost came in at roughly $28,000. Major label albums in the mid-70s could run 10 or 20 times that. When the tracks were finished, Scholz shipped them to LA for Delp to record vocals and for the final mix. He walked into Westlake Studios, afraid the professional engineers would see him as a hick from Massachusetts who didn't belong. They didn't, because the recordings sounded extraordinary. Epic received the final mixes and had no idea that most of what they were hearing had been tracked in a basement by one person. Of the 8 songs on the finished album, only Let Me Take You Home Tonight had been substantially recorded in Los Angeles. Everything else came from Watertown. The album was, by one estimate, about 90% basement. Epic had spent money to make a professional rock album. Tom Scholz had just proved he didn't need their studio, their process, or their system. On August 25, 1976, Epic released a record called Boston. The name wasn't even Scholz's idea. John Boylan suggested it. Scholz went along with a title he never much cared for. Then Epic did what labels do. They tried to build a narrative. They backed the launch with an advertising slogan, "Better music through science." It positioned Scholz as a novelty act. The engineer who plays guitar. The nerd who rocks. Scholz hated it. He wanted the ads pulled and made that clear in a heated exchange with Walter Yetnikoff, then president of Epic's parent company CBS Records International. Yetnikoff wouldn't budge. The slogan stuck, and so did the image. The mad scientist in the basement. That was something Epic cultivated, and Scholz resented it. This was the first sign of a deeper conflict. Scholz had built the sound. Now the label wanted to build the story. And Scholz wasn't interested in surrendering control of either one. But the music cut through everything. More Than a Feeling hit the top 5. The album sold 2 million copies by the end of 1976. It became the best-selling debut in U.S. history at the time, eventually moving over 17 million copies domestically. And Scholz was still working at Polaroid. He went back to his day job after the album came out. Disco was dominant. He genuinely wasn't sure a rock record would find an audience. Then coworkers started running up to him in the back rooms of Polaroid's offices. "Your song is playing in the drafting department." He'd race to the nearest radio and catch the tail end of More Than a Feeling. It took months before he heard the entire song play through on the air. Even then, he didn't quit. He asked Polaroid for a formal leave of absence first, just to keep his medical benefits. The man who'd just made the best-selling debut album in the country didn't trust the music industry enough to burn his safety net. So the industry had what it wanted: a massive hit, a touring band, an audience begging for more. And now the clock started. The contract said 10 albums in 6 years. That meant roughly 1 album every 7 months. For a man who had spent 6 years perfecting 8 songs. The math didn't work. It was never going to work. But nobody at Epic seemed to have done the math. Epic wanted the next record fast. Scholz wanted the next record right. The second album, Don't Look Back, arrived in August 1978, 2 years after the debut. By modern standards, that's nothing. By 1970s industry standards, Epic considered it a long wait. Scholz recorded it the same way, mostly alone in his basement, which he'd upgraded and renamed Hideaway Studio. The album went straight to number 1. It sold over 1 million copies in its first 10 days. The title track hit number 4 on the Hot 100. But Scholz wasn't happy. The album barely cracked 34 minutes. He later said openly that it was released before it was complete. Don't Look Back sold 4 million copies. By any normal standard, a massive hit. But it was less than a quarter of what the debut had moved. And Scholz drew a lesson from the difference. He would never again release an album before he believed it was ready. Not for Epic, not for CBS, not for anyone. That decision put him on a collision course with Walter Yetnikoff, the president of CBS Records International. Yetnikoff wasn't used to artists telling CBS when an album would be finished. At one meeting, he sat Scholz down and told him a story about another Epic band, Cheap Trick, that had been holding out on new material. CBS had hit them with a $52 million lawsuit. Yetnikoff looked at Scholz and repeated a single sentence twice. CBS can be a real prick when it wants to be. The message wasn't subtle. By 1983, 5 years after Don't Look Back, CBS was still waiting for a third Boston album. Scholz was working at his own pace, in his own basement, building the record he wanted to build. The label's response was blunt. They suspended Boston's royalty payments from the first 2 albums. The idea was simple: cut off the money, force the artist to deliver. Scholz wrote Yetnikoff a letter. The key passage has been quoted so many times it's practically carved in stone. He said that apparently some people at Epic felt he should be punished for refusing to sacrifice quality. And then he added that he would never release a second-rate record to fill CBS's pockets, or his own. CBS sued. The breach of contract claim reportedly sought somewhere between $20 million and $60 million, depending on the source. The label called Scholz creatively uncooperative. That was their legal position. The man who'd built the best-selling debut album in American history from a basement was being told he wasn't cooperating creatively. Scholz countersued for unpaid royalties. The litigation dragged on for years, but CBS had miscalculated. They assumed that cutting off Scholz's income would cripple him. It didn't, because while all of this was happening, Scholz had done something the label hadn't expected. He'd started a company. In 1980, while CBS was preparing to sue him, Scholz founded a company called Scholz Research and Development. He took the recording technology he'd been building for years, devices he'd originally invented just to get better sounds out of his own basement, and turned them into products for other musicians. His first commercial release was the Power Soak, the first guitar amplifier attenuator ever mass-produced. It let guitarists crank a tube amp to full distortion without shaking the walls. Then, in 1982, he released the Rockman, a portable headphone guitar amplifier, small enough to clip on a belt. It simulated the sound of a crank studio rig at living room volume. It cost a fraction of what professional gear cost, and it became one of the defining guitar tools of the 1980s. The Rockman ended up on records by Def Leppard, ZZ Top, Joe Satriani, and David Gilmour. Scholz had over 30 patents to his name. The man CBS thought they were bankrupting had quietly built a second career that didn't need a record label at all. In April 1985, a New York judge ruled that the CBS lawsuit lacked merit, clearing Scholz to negotiate with another label. He signed with MCA Records. CBS tried to block the deal, issuing a cease and desist notice and demanding a royalty cut from MCA. They lost that fight too. On September 23, 1986, 8 years after Don't Look Back, Boston's third stage finally arrived. Scholz and Delp were the only original members on the record. Jim Mazdea returned on drums. guitarist Gary Peel, who'd left Sammy Hagar's touring band, joined the project. The album had been recorded at Scholz's home studio over 6 years through what he described as floods and power failures. Its lead single, Amanda, written back in 1980, became Boston's first and only #1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100. The album itself debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. It was eventually certified 4 times platinum. It was also the first CD format album to be certified gold by the RIAA. The industry had gotten its album. It just took 8 years, a label switch, and a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. And Scholz did it entirely on his terms. He later called it a landmark case. He said he never set out to be a crusader when it came to cleaning up the record business, but somehow, that's what happened. But there was a problem with winning this way. Nobody else could work at Tom Scholz's speed. The gap between Third Stage and the next Boston album was another 8 years. The one after that, 9. The final studio record arrived in 2013, 11 years after its predecessor. 5 studio albums in 37 years. Each one recorded in a basement. Each one on his schedule. Each one built almost entirely by one person. Scholz once described his working method to the Washington Post. He keeps notebooks for every song, notes to the producer, the engineer, the arranger, the performer, all addressed to different people in the studio. And they're all named Tom Scholz. That's the paradox the industry never solved. The thing that made Boston worth millions was Tom Scholz's total control. And the thing that made Boston nearly impossible to manage was exactly the same. Go back to the beginning. A record executive in 1975, holding a tape he can't explain. He thinks he's discovered a band. He hasn't. He's discovered a process. One man's obsessive, isolating, perfectionist method for turning sound into something the listener can feel in their chest. The music industry thought it had signed Boston. What it had actually signed was Tom Scholz's way of making music. And that was something the industry could sell, but never control.